It is a truth perhaps insufficiently recognized in polite society that a man may expire quite suddenly upon a parquet floor without entirely discommoding the household cat. Certainly, when the unfortunate body of Canon Almeric Stanhope was discovered in the conservatory of Little Wintlebury Rectory, his hands frozen in a grotesque attitude of supplication, a decanter of crème de menthe upturned beside him, and a curious antique brass poker laid lovingly across the cranium. The tabby known locally, and some said legally, as the Reverend Spiritual Confidant, Mrs. Agatha, was observed to be asleep atop said implement, purring faintly and exuding an air of moral superiority. It was this very tableau that greeted Lord Peter, Deathbred and Whimsy, complete with capelet, cane, and an expression that suggested the whole business had been staged by a third-rate dramatist suffering from theological indigestion. He removed his pince-nez, peered at the cat with detached interest, and remarked to the stiffened Inspector Craik of the local constabulary, "I say, Craik, it's not entirely orthodox for one's murder weapon to come pre-cushioned. Has anyone inquired as to the cat's alibi?" Craik, a man of narrow moustache and narrower humour, sniffed. "She's not talking, my lord." "No," murmured Whimsy, crouching with surprising agility to peer at the emerald-green stain spreading across the flagstone. "But I dare say she might be coaxed. All cats are pagans at heart, and given the canon's reputation for thundering sermons and tepid milk, I shouldn't be astonished if Mrs. Agatha simply executed the judgment of Bast herself." The murder, though Craik referred to it as a regrettable incident pending forensic confirmation, had occurred some 6 hours prior, or so the village of Little Wintlebury believed. It had not taken long for the tale to ripple outward. Canon Stanhope dead, the weapon both obscure and ornamental, and the only eyewitness a tabby with theological leanings. Lady Dowager Gertrude Finch Wilberforce, a woman whose collarbones appeared carved from ecclesiastical marble, had sent for Lord Peter with the crispness of a telegram and the assumption of instant compliance. "It's a dreadful thing, Peter. You must come at once. The bishop is in hysterics, and the curate has lost all sense of scripture." Whimsy, who had been reclining at ease in Piccadilly with a suspiciously good volume of Marlowe and a disturbingly bad cup of coffee, had acquiesced out of equal parts curiosity and boredom. And so, here he was, watching a team of policemen fumble about the conservatory like first-form boys at a Latin exam. The canon lay face up, eyes glassy, mouth open in what one presumed had once been protest. The expression now bore more resemblance to that of a parishioner cornered by a particularly ambitious bell-ringer. "Notice anything odd?" asked Craik with forced jocularity, presumably in the hopes Whimsy would spot. Something both vital and self-explanatory. Whimsy tapped his chin. "Well, the crème de menthe, for one. Unusual choice for a man of his ascetic reputation. And that poker, it's not of English make. Possibly Portuguese. Early 18th century. Decorative. Also," he turned to the windows, "this glass is triple-paned. Soundproof. I say, Craik, did anyone hear anything?" Craik frowned. "Not a soul. The cook says she was in the scullery with the wireless on. The gardener left at noon. And the housekeeper, Miss Scarrow, claims she was polishing the sacristy plate. All very decent occupations," said Whimsy cheerfully. "And the body was discovered by the curate, James Lutterworth. Seems a quiet fellow. Bit pale. Bit too quiet, if you ask me." Said Whimsy. He was looking at the floor now, examining faint muddy impressions near the side door, a smear of something half-cleaned on a copper watering can, and a single broken petal crushed beneath the canon's polished instep. He stood abruptly. "Well then, I suppose I ought to speak to the household. But do send someone to keep an eye on Mrs. Agatha. She may yet be persuaded to talk, given the appropriate inducements. Cold pheasant, perhaps." Craik rolled his eyes, but Whimsy was already gliding down the corridor in search of tea, testimony, and possibly trouble. Behind him, the brass poker gleamed beneath the dozing cat's paw. It had, Whimsy thought, a rather smug expression for an inanimate object. Whimsy's progress down the long corridor of Little Wintlebury Rectory was marked by the faint creak of ancient oak beneath Persian carpet, the tick of a grandfather clock that insisted, rather desperately, on being 5 minutes slow, and the scent of stale ecclesiastical flowers. Lilies, mostly, with a faint undertone of despair. He paused outside the morning room, where Craik had arranged the remaining household members for interview, and took a moment to adjust his cuffs. The details, after all, were everything. In murder, as in poetry, what is not said is often louder than what is. The room was chintz-heavy and overwhelmed with family photographs of people long gone and largely indistinguishable. A fire had been lit unnecessarily, and the atmosphere was heavy with the sort of tension that smells faintly of boiled cabbage and poorly concealed anxiety. The first to be interviewed was Miss Scarrow, the housekeeper, a thin, grim woman in her 50s who had the complexion of someone who had never allowed herself the luxury of sun, sentiment, or soft furnishings. She sat stiffly on the edge of a button-backed armchair, hands folded over one another with a sort of Protestant severity. "I was polishing the sacristy plate," she said for the 3rd time, her voice crisp and unyielding. The canon insisted upon spotless silver, especially before a holy day. "Indeed," said Whimsy, sinking into the opposite chair with an elegance that suggested he might have been born to interrogate recalcitrant housekeepers from that very angle. "Tell me, Miss Scarrow, was it usual for the canon to take his aperitif in the conservatory?" Her mouth tightened into a line sharp enough to slice communion wafers. It was not. He rarely drank anything stronger than watered sherry. That green liquor, it was a gift from one of his parishioners. He said it was vulgar and refused to touch it. But vulgarity has its moments, wouldn't you say? She gave him a look so pointed it could have hung vestments. "Not in this house, my lord." "And yet there it was," mused Whimsy. "The crème de menthe, open, half-poured, a stray glass. You're quite sure you didn't see him take it?" "I did not. And what of Mrs. Agatha?" A pause, slight but telling. "The cat, my lord?" "Unless the canon had a mistress in the vestry of the same name, yes. She follows him everywhere, always has. He allowed her more liberties than he did most people. The animal was in the room, I believe. She has the habit of nesting in that dreadful old blanket on the chaise longue." "Ah," said Whimsy, "a creature of habit, like most murderers. Thank you, Miss Scarrow. That will be all, for now. Perhaps ask the cook to come in?" He let her go without further comment, but his eyes lingered thoughtfully on the pattern her tightly laced shoes had left on the rug. A woman like Miss Scarrow rarely missed a thing and never forgave a slight. He filed that away with the other irrelevant details currently forming a neat little queue in the back of his mind. Mrs. Brecknell, the cook, arrived next, smelling faintly of sweat and impatience. "Can't say I heard a thing, my lord. Wireless was on, and I was elbow-deep in pudding basins. It's Trinity Sunday, and the canon insisted on syllabub. Proper. Syllabub, mind you. Not that Frenchified rubbish." "And the canon was alive when you last saw him?" "He'd just finished a bit of lunch. Plain boiled sole, no sauce, and said he was going to write his sermon. That was about 1. I didn't see him after that. Wouldn't normally. He didn't approve of kitchen gossip." Whimsy smiled faintly. "And did you approve of him?" Her eyebrows twitched. "He was strict, thought a well-run kitchen was evidence of moral virtue. I didn't care for his tone, if that's what you're asking, but I wouldn't have knocked him on the head with a poker, if that's your meaning." Whimsy inclined his head. "I wouldn't have suspected it. The syllabub is your alibi, I imagine. Along with a pudding the size of St. Paul's and a gooseberry fool that refuses to set. If that's not proof of innocence, nothing is." She was dismissed too, with a brief note about gooseberries jotted down in his pocketbook. The curate was a different matter. James Lutterworth was a pale, nervous-looking man with the kind of receding hairline that implied a life of apologizing for things that weren't his fault. He wore a collar slightly askew and had the air of someone who might faint at a particularly forceful hymn. "I found him just after evensong," he said in a tremulous voice, wringing his hands as if attempting to extract some absolution from them. I'd gone to find him. He didn't come down for tea. That was unusual." "Indeed," said Whimsy. "Especially in June. How did you find the body?" "Slumped in the chair. The cat, Mrs. Agatha, was on the blanket. I thought he'd fainted at first or fallen asleep, but then I saw the blood. The poker, there wasn't anything I could have done." Whimsy let the silence stretch. "And how would you describe your relationship with the canon?" Lutterworth looked at him, startled. He was my superior. A spiritual guide, I suppose. He was a hard man to please. Wanted discipline, clean sermons, little tolerance for doubt. But there was doubt. Another pause. He didn't like my interest in earlier texts. My thesis touched on comparative mysticism. He called it Gothic frippery. Rather puts a damper on scholarly ambition. Lutterworth flushed. He wanted the church to remain in the 18th century. "And what century would you prefer?" The curate hesitated. "One that still believes people can be saved." Whimsy studied him a moment longer. "Very admirable. And where were you between 1 o'clock and evensong?" "In my study. Reading. Translating a passage from Julian of Norwich. I had no cause to leave the room until I realized he was missing." "No visitors? No conversations?" "No." Whimsy made no comment. But as he ushered the curate out, he noted again that peculiar stillness, the sort that clings to a man who has walked through too many locked doors without knocking. Finally, the gardener was fetched, a robust fellow named Hatch with sun-scorched arms, and a vague sense that murder, while regrettable, was not his department. "I left just after noon, sir. Canon said the dahlias were an offence to the Lord and I'd best see about the hedge." "Did you see or hear anyone odd? Any visitors?" "No, sir. Quiet as a sermon on taxes." "And the conservatory. Did you tend the plants there?" "On Thursdays, usually. That poker, though, never seen it before. Doesn't belong to the house, far as I know." "No? Curious. It's older than most of the furniture." "Well, I wouldn't know about that." Whimsy rose slowly. "No, I dare say you wouldn't." As Hatch left, Whimsy remained still for a moment, alone again in the heavy hush of the rectory's parlour. He turned, paced once, and walked back into the hallway, where Craik awaited him with the expression of a man who suspects he is being left out of the joke. "Well?" Craik demanded. Whimsy clasped his hands behind his back. "Everyone heard nothing, everyone saw nothing, and yet, yes, the poker does not belong here. The creme de menthe is untouched, but its presence is theatrical. The window panes are too thick, and there is a very particular rose petal crushed beneath a dead man's heel. I think," he added, almost cheerfully, "we are about to be treated to a performance, though I must admit I haven't yet determined whether it's melodrama or farce." He turned back toward the conservatory, where Mrs. Agatha still dozed atop the murder weapon with the smug serenity of a cat who has already read the final page. Whimsy stood for a moment longer in the shadowed conservatory, eyes tracing the long curved outline of the brass poker beneath Mrs. Agatha's indolent form. The cat's rhythmic purring filled the silence, as if mocking the very idea of urgency. Outside, the garden swayed gently in the late spring breeze, a contrast of life and death that struck the detective as profoundly theatrical. "Craik," Whimsy murmured, "fetch me a box of matches and the canon's prayer book. I have a notion." Craik, who had thus far demonstrated remarkable patience with Lord Peter's whimsical interrogations, gave an odd glance but obeyed. Within moments, the prayer book was placed reverently on the polished mahogany table, and a match was struck, flaring briefly before being crushed beneath Whimsy's heel. "Lighting a fire in June is hardly orthodox," said Craik. "Not for warmth," said Whimsy dryly. "For illumination." He opened the book to a random page and began to leaf through, eyes sharp and brows knitting. The canon was a man of exact habits. I wonder if the page he last read was noted by the dog-eared fold of a corner or the indentations of a pencil. Craik raised an eyebrow. "You're hoping for a clue from his devotions?" "Not so much a clue as a motive," said Whimsy. "A man's faith can be as revealing as his alibi." He turned back to the body, where the coppery scent of dried blood lingered faintly in the air. "I want to know why the poker, and why that particular poker," he added. "It is far too conspicuous for an accidental weapon." "Possibly a statement?" mused Craik, his mustache twitching. Whimsy smiled thinly. "Exactly. And statements are made to be heard, if one knows how to listen." He crouched beside the conservatory window, examining the triple-glazed panes with careful scrutiny. Outside, the garden path curved gently past a bed of roses, their petals a riotous crimson. He glanced down at the floor again, where that singular crushed petal caught the light, small and incongruous. "Tell me, Craik," Whimsy said. "When was the last time this window was opened?" The inspector scratched his head. "No one's mentioned it. Why?" "The triple glazing is unusual. Expensive. It suggests a desire to keep sounds in or out. If the window had been open, there should be some trace. Fresh dust, pollen, disturbance." Whimsy leaned closer, peering for a seam or scratch. "And yet this petal is here, crushed beneath the canon's foot." "Was the canon standing by the window?" His chair faced inward. "The presence of the petal suggests he moved there after the fact. Or someone else did." The detective straightened and stepped back. "Tell me, Craik, what do we know of the canon's social life? His enemies, admirers, debts?" "Nothing much," said Craik, a trace of frustration breaking through. "He was strict, some said severe. No known debts, though the bishop seemed quite relieved by his passing. The only recent visitor was a Mr. Thomas Fairclough, a solicitor from London. Came yesterday afternoon." Whimsy's eyes sparkled with interest. "Ah, a solicitor. One might expect secrets to come to light in his company. Where is this Mr. Fairclough now?" "In the village, staying at the inn. Said he would remain until the inquest." "Excellent." Whimsy pulled on his gloves with a flourish. "Then we have someone to speak to, and a timeline to reconstruct." Before leaving the conservatory, Whimsy paused to address Mrs. Agatha, who had stretched languidly and now fixed him with a gaze that might have felled lesser men. "And you, madam, will be no impediment to my inquiries, I trust?" The cat flicked her tail, unimpressed. Outside, the rectory garden seemed a place of gentle order, but to Whimsy it was a maze of contradictions. The dahlias were indeed present but neglected, the rose bushes carefully pruned, yet with that one stray petal crushed beneath the body. The gardener's testimony, though straightforward, left room for ambiguity. Did Hatch leave precisely at noon, or was his exit less punctual? Such minutiae were the threads of truth in this tangled web. The solicitor's lodgings at the village inn were modest but orderly, a small room smelling faintly of tobacco and old paper. Mr. Thomas Fairclough greeted Whimsy with a practiced smile that did little to mask his nervousness. "Lord Peter Whimsy, I presume. I gather you're here about Canon Stanhope." "Indeed. I trust the journey was pleasant?" "Somewhat, though one never enjoys such visits under these circumstances." "Quite so. Now, Mr. Fairclough, your business with the canon, was it urgent?" Fairclough hesitated. He had matters concerning his will. Some revisions he wished to make. He was concerned about the disposition of certain properties. "Ah, the perennial issue of land and legacy." "Yes, the rectory and several adjoining farms. He felt certain family members were less deserving than others." "Envy among kin, then?" "Precisely." And were these revisions expected to be contentious? Fairclough nodded. The canon feared disputes. He was troubled by his nephew, Reginald Stanhope. Whimsy's mind clicked into gear. Reginald Stanhope, the sulking heir. Yes, known for a somewhat erratic temperament, present at the rectory during the weekend. Interesting. Was he here at the time of the canon's death? I believe so. I saw him leave shortly before dinner last evening. Whimsy made a mental note. The nephew's whereabouts must be established precisely. Timelines, alibis. Those were the scaffolding upon which this puzzle would hang. Tell me, Mr. Fairclough, did the canon mention any other visitors? Anyone from the village or the diocese who might have had cause to upset him? Fairclough considered. Only Miss Beatrice Collingwood. She's a local historian and an acquaintance of the canons. They often debated theology. Ah, an intellectual sparring partner. Yes, though some said their debates bordered on acrimony. She was here this morning, I believe. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. I must speak with Miss Collingwood. Back at the rectory, the detective found Lady Dowager Gertrude Finch Wilberforce in the drawing-room, a statue of Victorian hauteur with a lorgnette that seemed designed more for sharp criticism than visual aid. Peter, I trust you're making progress. The bishop is beside himself, and the vicarage is positively crawling with reporters. Indeed, Lady Finch Wilberforce, though I find it curious that the press have fixated on the cat rather than the man. She tutted. Mrs. Agatha is more dignified than most humans I know, and less prone to scandal. True, though I am less interested in her morals than in her movements. A cat that sits on the murder weapon is a curious piece of evidence in itself. Gertrude nodded gravely. You must forgive the village. Little Wintlebury is not accustomed to such spectacles. Whimsy allowed himself a faint smile. Nor am I, Lady Finch Wilberforce. Nor am I. His next interview was with Miss Beatrice Collingwood, who received him with the stiff cordiality of one accustomed to controlling every nuance of conversation. My research, she said, concerns the church and its forgotten saints. The canon was fascinated by St. Wilfrid, though we rarely agreed on interpretation. And this morning, you were at the rectory? Yes, to discuss a forthcoming lecture. We had a rather spirited debate on the nature of divine justice. And afterwards? I left around midday. The canon was well, if a little distracted. Distracted. She smiled thinly. He feared that some in the parish were not as pious as they appeared. That hypocrisy breeds worse sins than open heresy. Whimsy nodded slowly. A man with a fine sense of judgment, then. And enemies? She glanced sharply. No one I would name, but in every community there are those who chafe at scrutiny. Whimsy's mind sifted through the fragments of his conversations, the careful silences, the contradictory statements, and the unspoken fears. The picture was becoming clearer, yet more troubling. Outside, a clock chimed the hour, its tone muffled, as if filtered through the thick walls of the rectory. Whimsy paused and glanced up. Craik, he called, I believe it is time we examine the alibis with a little more care. The devil, as ever, resides in the details. The inspector nodded, pen poised over his notebook. Whimsy's gaze returned to the broken petal on the floor, the poker beneath the cat's paw, and the faintest hint of unease that whispered through the room like a half-forgotten prayer. In Little Wintlebury Rectory, the game had only just begun. The thick oak-panelled walls of Little Wintlebury Rectory seemed to close in as Lord Peter Whimsy and Inspector Craik settled down with their notes. The ancient grandfather clock in the hall chimed again, its sonorous toll marking time with implacable regularity. A reminder, perhaps, that every second here was accounted for, every minute a possible alibi or fatal discrepancy. Whimsy rubbed his chin thoughtfully, casting his eyes over the carefully scribbled statements. The nephew, Reginald, leaves shortly before dinner, you say? Exactly so, Craik replied. He claims to have gone to the village pub, the Black Cock, to meet a friend. Several locals corroborate his presence. Ah, the classic pub alibi. It does rely heavily on the honesty of one's drinking companions. Indeed. Yet no one contests his story. Whimsy gave a half-smile. One must always consider whether those companions are truly impartial witnesses or simply sympathetic. He tapped his pipe against his palm. Tell me, Inspector, when exactly was the canon found? At 7:30, just after dinner was served. Mrs. Agatha was the one who discovered him. Did Mrs. Agatha come straight to the housekeeper, or did she interrupt the meal? Straight to the housekeeper, and then to the vicarage kitchen where she raised the alarm. Whimsy's gaze flicked to the cat, which regarded him from its throne with the same air of detached disdain. Mrs. Agatha is no doubt a creature of habit. It would be prudent to understand her routine, to discern if any anomaly in her behavior might betray a secret. Craig nodded. She spends most of the day in the conservatory, only leaving for meals or brief patrols of the garden. And the cook? Mrs. Miller, she's been here 15 years. Said she heard nothing unusual except the church bells ringing at 6. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. The bells. That is interesting. What time did the bells ring? 6 o'clock sharp, for evening prayer. Odd, sir, said Whimsy. The bells, the timing of meals, the nephew's departure. Everything seems punctuated with precision, yet something, some detail, feels amiss. He rose and moved to the window, staring out over the dusky garden. I want to understand the geography of sound in this place. Geography of sound? Craig echoed, frowning. Precisely. The church bells ring at 6. Could the canon have been murdered before that? After? Difficult to say. Whimsy pulled his notebook closer. If the canon was alive at 6, then the timeline shifts. Mrs. Agatha's discovery at 7:30 suggests a window of 90 minutes, which would be ample time for an intruder. Or for an insider, Whimsy said quietly. The next hours were spent in meticulous cross-examination of the household staff, the gardener, and the local shopkeepers. Whimsy's questions seemed innocuous at first, asking about the positioning of clocks, the habits of servants, the precise timing of meals. But beneath this veneer of casual interest was a methodical pattern of probing the facts, uncovering contradictions. The gardener, Mr. Hatch, insisted he had been in the greenhouse tending to roses between noon and 2, and again briefly at 5 to water the dahlias. His testimony seemed straightforward, yet Whimsy noticed the faint traces of soil on the soles of his boots suggested more recent activity. Mr. Hatch, Whimsy said smoothly, you say you were in the greenhouse at 5? Yes, my lord. And you left the conservatory door locked when you went in? Of course. And yet the door was found unlocked this morning. Hatch flushed. Must have been an oversight. I always lock up. Whimsy made a note. An oversight or a clue? We shall see. Meanwhile, the curious detail of the triple-glazed window nagged at Whimsy's mind. He returned to the conservatory alone, the fading light casting long shadows across the floor. He examined the window's hinges and seals, noting a faint smudge on the inside pane. A partial fingerprint. He pressed his gloved finger beside the mark. This glass is not often handled, he muttered. Suddenly, a small noise startled him, a soft thud from the corridor. Mrs. Miller, the cook, appeared, carrying a tray with a fresh pot of tea. I thought you might like some, Lord Peter, she said, her voice cautious. Thank you, Mrs. Miller. Your kindness is much appreciated. Whimsy accepted the cup and took a sip, his mind racing. Did you notice anything unusual last evening? Sounds, smells, visitors? Mrs. Miller hesitated. No, sir. Only the usual bustle. Except, I did hear the sound of footsteps near the back stairs around 7. Back stairs? Whimsy's interest piqued. Yes. The stairs lead up to the servants' quarters and the nursery. Usually quiet after 6. Did you investigate? No, sir. I thought it might be one of the maids. An excellent assumption. But what if the footsteps belonged to someone else? Whimsy's mind turned over possibilities, the neat edifice of alibis beginning to crack. If someone had used the servants' back stairs, they might have avoided detection. He thanked Mrs. Miller and made his way to the servants' quarters, his footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. The small rooms were plainly furnished, with a faint scent of lavender and soap. He examined the door to the back stairs, noting the lock's mechanism, a simple catch easily manipulated. "Curious," he murmured. "A route for a shadow to come and go unseen." Returning downstairs, Whimsy found Craig consulting his notebook. "I've been thinking about the nephew," Whimsy said. "If Reginald left just before dinner, did anyone observe his return?" Craig frowned. "Number the housekeeper said he did not return until this morning." "Uh-huh." Whimsy's eyes gleamed. "Then we have a gap to explore." He glanced toward the cat again, who stretched languidly on the window seat. "Mrs. Agatha is an unwilling witness, but I intend to learn what she saw or heard." The evening settled over little Wintlebury, with a creeping chill, the sort that whispered of secrets best left undisturbed. Yet Lord Peter Whimsy was no stranger to disturbing them. As the night deepened, the detective retired to the library to pore over parish records and the canon's correspondence, sent by the village post earlier in the day. Among the letters was a curious note from the bishop expressing impatience with the canon's intransigence regarding certain diocesan reforms. Whimsy folded the letter and placed it carefully aside. "Ecclesiastical politics," he mused, "a motive as old as the church itself." Craig appeared at the door. "Lord Peter, if you would care to join me for a stroll. Fresh air might clear our heads." Outside, the village was draped in mist, lanterns casting halos in the damp air. They walked in silence for a while before Whimsy spoke. "Consider, Inspector. The canon's death was not a crime of passion, but a precise, calculated act. The choice of weapon, the timing, the staging of the scene with Mrs. Agatha and the cat, each element is deliberate." Craig exhaled slowly. "So, who stands to benefit? Not just in terms of inheritance or influence," said Whimsy, "but in the shifting balance of power within this small community." He paused beneath an ancient oak, its gnarled limbs reaching like arthritic fingers into the night sky. "Tomorrow, we must reconstruct the timeline with greater precision. I suspect the truth lies in the smallest inconsistencies." Craig nodded. "Then we have our work cut out." Whimsy smiled thinly. "Indeed, the devil is in the details, Inspector, and we shall find him yet." The dawn crept in quietly over little Wintlebury, filtering through the mullioned windows of the rectory with a hesitant light, as though even the morning had an inkling of the dark events it was about to witness. Lord Peter Whimsy, already up, was seated by the study desk, examining his notes by the flickering flame of a solitary candle. The logical framework of the mystery was beginning to coalesce, and his mind was a meticulous engine turning through each detail with relentless precision. Inspector Craig arrived punctually, his expression sober but alert. "I've taken the liberty of reviewing the village accounts and timetable," he said, handing Whimsy a small sheaf of papers. "The pub's logbook confirms Reginald's arrival at the Black Cock at 6:15 p.m. Whimsy glanced over the document, his eyebrow lifting ever so slightly. "Curious. A man who leaves before dinner, only to arrive 15 minutes after the bells ring at 6. An intriguing discrepancy, especially considering the distance between here and the village is no more than a brisk 20-minute walk." "Indeed," said Craig. "He claims to have left shortly before 6. The village is quiet at that hour, and the streets empty." Whimsy tapped the table thoughtfully. "And the timing of the canon's murder? We know the body was discovered at 7:30, but when was the fatal blow struck?" "According to the coroner's report, the wound was inflicted no earlier than 6 o'clock, possibly after." "Then Reginald's timeline warrants closer scrutiny. If he left before dinner, and was seen in the village at 6:15. Where was he during the interim? Whimsy asked, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Before Craig could respond, a sudden meow echoed softly through the hall. The cat, insouciant as ever, wound itself around Whimsy's legs, demanding attention as if to remind him that even the smallest creature had its role in this sordid play. "Ah, dear Miss Whiskers," Whimsy murmured. "Perhaps you hold secrets even your masters do not suspect." He reached down to stroke the feline's fur absently, but his mind raced onward. The servants' quarters, the back stairs, the unlocked conservatory door, all these seemed insignificant on the surface, but whispered to him of hidden movements. "Let us revisit the conservatory, Inspector," Whimsy said abruptly. "There are details there that merit a second look." The two men crossed the hall and stepped into the dim light of the glass house. The air inside was still, scented faintly of damp earth and wilted blooms. Whimsy approached the triple-glazed window, examining the smudged glass carefully. "Remarkable," he said. "This faint fingerprint here, almost imperceptible to the casual observer." Craig peered closer. Could it be from the canon? Unlikely, given its placement on the inner pane, where he would have no reason to touch. Whimsy tapped the glass lightly. More likely an intruder, or someone eager to mask their presence. He turned and examined the lock on the conservatory door again, noting a faint scratch on the catch. "Do we know if this door was locked when Mrs. Agatha found the body?" Craig nodded. She said it was unlocked, which struck her as odd. "Indeed, it should have been secured, given the chill and the late hour." Whimsy's eyes gleamed. Someone left it open deliberately, or neglected their duty. They proceeded toward the servants' stairwell. Whimsy examined the lock there with care, then ran a finger along the wood paneling. The easiest way in and out, concealed from the main household's view, and one wonders whether Mrs. Agatha would know if a shadow passed her by. Just then, the housekeeper appeared, her face a mask of nervous propriety. "Mrs. Agatha," Whimsy began gently, "I wish to understand your evening more clearly. You discovered the canon at 7:30, yes?" "Yes, my lord." "Were you alone in the house then? Did you hear anything unusual before your discovery?" She hesitated, eyes flicking away. "Only the cat, my lord. She was restless." Whimsy's glance shifted to the feline, who twitched its whiskers with a sly air. Restless cats often see what humans miss. And what of the other servants? "All were busy preparing for the night," Mrs. Agatha replied quickly. "The cook in the kitchen, the gardener outside. No strangers came near." "And yet the door to the conservatory was found unlocked." "Yes, sir. That puzzles me as well." "Did you check the back stairs yourself?" "No, my lord. I would not presume." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "A wise discretion, Mrs. Agatha. But might I persuade you to allow me to examine the back stairwell?" Reluctantly, she consented and led them there. The narrow stairwell was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of damp wood. Whimsy's keen eyes noted faint scuff marks on the worn steps. "Someone has come and gone recently," he murmured. "But who?" From the kitchen came a sudden clatter. Mrs. Miller appeared, bearing a tray laden with teacups and a small plate of biscuits. "Forgive the interruption, my lord," she said, "but the cook thought you might be cold." "Your kindness is appreciated, Mrs. Miller." Whimsy accepted the tea, his gaze never resting. "Have you noticed anything unusual last night? Any odd noises? Strangers in the vicinity?" Mrs. Miller pursed her lips. "Only the usual. But I did hear footsteps near the back stairs around 7. "Ah," Whimsy said. "That is most enlightening. And no one else saw or heard these footsteps?" "Only me, my lord. I thought it might be the maid, so I did not pay much heed." "Yet the maid was accounted for elsewhere." "Yes, preparing the dining room." Whimsy folded his hands. "We have here a small puzzle piece. A faint sound, a door unlocked, a trace of a fingerprint, all pointing to movement where none should have been." Craik exhaled. But what of motive? Who stands to gain from the canon's demise? Not merely gain, Whimsy corrected gently, but revenge, control, liberation from some unseen bond. The human heart is a far more tangled maze than any church's cloisters. Later that morning, Whimsy summoned the nephew Reginald. The young man arrived promptly, his expression a mixture of defiance and unease. Mr. Reginald, Whimsy, began, "Your departure shortly before dinner and arrival at the pub at 6:15 has been noted. Might I inquire, what were your precise movements during the half-hour between?" Reginald shifted uncomfortably. I took a walk. Needed fresh air." "A walk?" Whimsy echoed. "Through the village?" "Yes, to clear my head." "And no one saw you?" Reginald shrugged. "I passed no one. The village is quiet in the early evening." "Yet the pub records your arrival at 6:15. "Yes, I went there directly from my walk." "Very well. And upon your return this morning, did you notice anything unusual at the rectory?" "No, sir. Everything was as I left it." "Did you speak to your uncle that evening?" Reginald's gaze faltered. "No, sir. He was in the library." "And you did not see him again?" "No." Whimsy's expression was unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Reginald. Your candor is noted." When the door closed behind the nephew, Whimsy turned to Craik. "The walk is an inconvenient alibi. No witnesses, no proof. Yet it creates a gap where shadows may lurk." Craik nodded grimly. "And what of the bishop's letter? Ecclesiastical quarrels can be bitter." "Indeed. I intend to examine the canon's recent correspondence in greater detail. There may be more than a simple parish dispute at play." The afternoon passed with methodical inquiry. Whimsy requested to see the canon's study, noting the orderly but sparse desk. Among the scattered papers lay a manuscript with portions heavily edited, and a diary that revealed increasing anxiety over some unspecified threat. "It appears our canon was troubled," Whimsy observed. "Not merely by church politics, but by something more personal." As evening approached, a knock at the door announced the arrival of the vicar of the neighboring parish, Reverend Smythe. He bore a solemn expression. "Lord Peter, I trust I'm not intruding?" "Not at all, Reverend," Whimsy said cordially. "Please join us." Reverend Smythe took a seat, his fingers nervously clutching a folded handkerchief. "I came to speak on a matter concerning the canon," he said quietly. "He confided in me recently, about an old acquaintance, a man named Lawrence, someone from his past who had reappeared." "Lawrence?" Whimsy mused. "A name worth noting." The Reverend nodded. "Yes, they had a falling out years ago, though no one knew the reason." "Do you know where this Lawrence might be now?" "Not precisely, but there were rumors of his presence in the nearby town of Ruddington." Whimsy's eyes gleamed with renewed purpose. "Then a visit to Ruddington may be in order." Inspector Craik, ever practical, rubbed his hands together. "A journey tomorrow, perhaps?" "Indeed. But before that," Whimsy said, "there remains the matter of the back stairs and the unlocked door. The devil, as always, resides in such trifles." As the night deepened and the house settled into uneasy silence, Whimsy sat by the fire, pipe in hand, reflecting on the day's revelations. The threads of the mystery were being woven into a pattern, intricate and subtle, but he sensed the knot was close at hand. The cat, curling once more on the window-sill, blinked knowingly. There were secrets beneath the polite veneer of little Wintleberry, and Lord Peter Whimsy was determined to unveil them all, no matter how deeply they were buried. The following morning dawned grey and tentative, a pallid light seeping through the high mullions of the rectory windows, as if the heavens themselves hesitated to brighten the day after the night's grim revelations. Lord Peter Whimsy and Inspector Craik prepared to depart for Ruddington with the deliberate precision of men who knew that in investigations such as these, haste often obscured, rather than uncovered, truth. The village was still and quiet as they set off, the rectory's familiar silhouette shrinking behind them beneath a gathering mist. Whimsy's mind, far from idle, was already assembling the fragments of the canon's tangled past like a master artisan fitting together an ornate jigsaw. The mention of Lawrence, an old acquaintance, a shadow cast from a distant chapter, had, as Whimsy suspected, opened a door to the more personal strata beneath the surface tensions of Little Wintlebury. The road to Ruddington was lined with drooping elms, their branches etched starkly against the dull sky. The village itself, modest and respectable, displayed no outward signs of the turmoil that had presumably followed Lawrence's arrival. Whimsy noted the precise chiming of the church clock, an exactness that would later prove less trivial than it seemed. Arriving at the village inn, a respectable establishment where news traveled as quickly as the stout poured, they made enquiries discreetly but firmly. The landlord, a stout man with a no-nonsense gaze, remembered a Mr. Lawrence passing through some days ago, looking a bit ill at ease, he said, and asking after a Canon St. John. Seemed to be carrying old wounds, if you ask me. That's no doubt the man we seek, Whimsy murmured, his voice low and measured. We must locate him promptly, Inspector. The trail led them to a modest lodging house at the far edge of the village, where Lawrence was said to have taken refuge. The landlady, a sharp-eyed woman with a clipped tone, confirmed his presence but warned that he was reluctant to see visitors. A troubled man, she said, quiet and withdrawn, always glancing over his shoulder. A knock at the door produced a gaunt figure, eyes wary but not without a flicker of recognition upon seeing Whimsy. You seek me, Lawrence said, voice roughened by disuse. I suppose I have no choice but to talk. Within the cramped sitting room, the man unfolded a tale of a friendship soured by betrayal and a grievous misunderstanding. Years before, Lawrence and the canon had been close, bound by shared confidences and aspirations for the church. But a secret, one Lawrence implied was a betrayal of the deepest kind, had fractured their bond irreparably. I came back to clear my name, Lawrence said, to confront the past and perhaps seek forgiveness, but I found only death. Whimsy listened with the patient detachment of a surgeon inspecting a wound. And this secret, Mr. Lawrence, what was it? Lawrence hesitated, then shook his head. Some things are better left buried. Yet the shade of guilt in his eyes was unmistakable, as was the fact that his return was anything but coincidental. He revealed he had sent a letter to the canon weeks before, imploring a meeting, a letter the canon had never mentioned. The timing was significant. It placed Lawrence in the village within the week of the murder, at a time when tensions were surely at their peak. Back in Little Wintlebury, the rectory stood in somber silence as Whimsy and Craik arrived with news. The discovery of Lawrence's letter, sent but unanswered, added a fresh layer to the mystery, a motive of confrontation or fear, perhaps, rather than mere inheritance or petty spite. Whimsy summoned the household once more, gathering the servants and the family in the drawing room. His gaze swept the room with its usual disarming clarity. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, we are all actors upon a stage where the truth must play its part, however uncomfortable. We now know of a second visitor, the shadow called Lawrence, who returned not merely to rattle old bones, but to provoke an encounter whose outcome we must consider. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Moreover, Whimsy continued, the unlocked conservatory door, the footsteps on the back stairs, the faint fingerprint, all hint at movement not accounted for. It is not mere chance that the cat chose to sleep upon the very instrument of death. No creature acts without instinct. Mrs. Agatha, ever the picture of decorum, crossed herself lightly. I beg your pardon, Lord Peter, but such talk of shadows and secrets unsettles the household. On the contrary, Whimsy replied gently, it is only by acknowledging the unseen that we illuminate the truth. A sudden knock at the door interrupted the discourse. The butler entered, bearing a small parcel addressed to the canon, found among his effects. Whimsy broke the seal and unfolded the contents, a series of letters, inked in an elegant hand, hinting at a clandestine dispute over parish funds and the suspicious disappearance of a substantial sum. The letters suggested that the canon had been blackmailed, or at least extorted, by an unknown party. Financial motives often lie at the heart of human tragedy, Whimsy observed, but rarely do they act alone. There is always an undercurrent of fear, of passion, or revenge. The discovery shifted the atmosphere in the room. The nephew, Reginald, paled perceptibly. "I had no knowledge of such matters," he stammered, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Nor did I," Mrs. Agatha said firmly. "The canon was a man of strict propriety." "Yet even propriety can conceal cracks," Whimsy replied. That evening, as the household retired, Whimsy lingered in the canon's study, piecing together the various documents, notes, and observations. The diary, the letters, the mysterious visitor Lawrence, the unexplained finances. All these threads tangled into a web that hinted at a motive far more complex than simple murder. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint scent of damp earth and something more elusive, perhaps regret, perhaps guilt. The cat, once again occupying its favorite windowsill, blinked into the shadows, its green eyes reflecting secrets yet untold. Whimsy mused silently. In the end, it is not the weapon, nor the wound, but the human heart that reveals the path to truth. Tomorrow promised to be a day of revelations, and the detective's mind was already racing toward the next puzzle piece that might unlock the mystery fully. As dawn began to pale the horizon with a timid blush, Lord Peter Whimsy found himself already deep in thought, seated once more in the rectory's drawing room. The weight of yesterday's discoveries lay heavily upon him, not in the sense of despair, but as a challenge worthy of the finest exercise of intellect and observation. He glanced casually at the assembled household, each figure arrayed with an almost theatrical sense of propriety and unease. There was something faintly comical, yet undeniably poignant, in the way people cling to manners when their world has been shaken to its foundations. Inspector Craik, less at ease in such genteel company, but no less attentive, took up a seat near the fireplace, the ruddy glow lending a soft warmth to his otherwise dour features. "Lord Peter," he murmured, "the whole affair becomes more tangled the deeper we delve. That letter from Lawrence, the unexplained finances, the unlocked door, it all paints a picture, but one with a confusing brush." Whimsy smiled, the dry curl of his lips suggesting amusement rather than reassurance. "Ah, Inspector, complexity is the very breath of a good mystery. We must remember that human nature is rarely straightforward, and the very minutiae that appear irrelevant are often the linchpins of truth." His eyes drifted towards the window where the ever-watchful cat basked in the early morning light, as if privy to secrets beyond mortal ken. "Now," Whimsy continued, "I wish to revisit some details which I fear have been overlooked amidst the more sensational." He rose and began to pace thoughtfully. "First, the question of time. We have accounts of the canon's movements on the evening of his demise, but they are, shall we say, somewhat lax in precision. The gardener claims to have seen him in the study at 7:30, yet the clock in the hall was observed by multiple witnesses to chime 8 only minutes later. The nurse insists she brought him his night medication at 8 o'clock sharp, yet the canon's body was found with the weapon still warm to the touch, suggesting a much narrower window. Craik nodded, his brow furrowed. The timeline does seem contradictory. Indeed, Whimsy's fingers steepled beneath his chin. The key lies in these contradictions, for where evidence conflicts, deception often resides. He turned to Mrs. Agatha, whose eyes remained steadfastly polite but watchful. "Madam, might I inquire again about the clocks? There are at least 3 within the rectory: the hall, the study, and the conservatory. Were they all functioning correctly?" Mrs. Agatha hesitated, then replied, The clocks are usually kept in good order, Lord Peter. But the one in the conservatory has been known to run a little fast. Uh-huh. Whimsy's smile was subtle but triumphant. And who is responsible for winding these clocks? The housekeeper, Mrs. Potts, usually attends to that task, came the reply. At that moment, the door opened to admit the housekeeper herself, a stout woman with a no-nonsense manner and an expression that spoke of long years spent managing domestic chaos with firm resolve. "I was told you wished to speak to me, my lord," she said. "Precisely, Mrs. Potts. I would be most obliged if you could tell us the state of the clocks on the night of the canon's death." Mrs. Potts folded her hands, her gaze steady. "Well, sir, the hall clock was wound just before dinner, as always. The study clock, I believe, was wound the same day, but the conservatory one, as Miss Agatha says, tends to run fast. I thought nothing of it. One can't be expected to attend every clock in a house as large as this." "Of course," Whimsy inclined his head politely. "Yet the conservatory clock might well be a factor in our timeline discrepancies." "Perhaps, sir," she admitted, "but I can't say I noticed it at the time." Whimsy then directed his attention to the servants' routine, probing gently but thoroughly. He discovered that the night nurse, Miss Hilda, who had been summoned to attend the canon in recent weeks due to a lingering cough, had a habit of locking up the conservatory door after her rounds. Yet on the night in question, it had been found unlocked. Her explanation was vague and slightly contradictory, though she insisted no one had been there after her last visit. The detective's gaze sharpened. "Miss Hilda, might anyone have had access to the conservatory after your rounds?" "Not that I know of, Lord Peter. The household is very strict about such things." Yet the door was found unlocked. The nurse blushed faintly. "I may have forgotten to secure it properly, my lord." Whimsy filed away the admission quietly. It was a trivial slip, but in a case where every detail mattered, nothing could be dismissed. Next, he turned to Reginald, the canon's nephew, whose pallor and nervous twitch betrayed his inner turmoil. The young man insisted on his innocence, yet Whimsy detected in his voice an undercurrent of resentment. "Reginald," Whimsy began, "I understand you have concerns about your uncle's will." The nephew's jaw tightened. "I merely hoped for clarity, Lord Peter." "Clarity, indeed." Whimsy's eyes twinkled with sardonic amusement. "You see, Reginald, legacies are often the bones upon which families quarrel. Might I inquire whether you were aware of any disputes regarding the canon's finances?" Reginald hesitated, then muttered, "He was a difficult man. Private, secretive. I never fully understood his affairs." A common lament. Whimsy's tone was dry, but secrets rarely remain buried without consequence. With this, he excused himself and Craik, seeking the solace of the garden, where the chill morning air cleared the mind as effectively as any cup of tea. There, as he pondered the subtle inconsistencies, a fresh detail emerged: the cat. It was Miss Agatha who recalled, somewhat reluctantly, that on the night of the murder, the animal had been unusually restless, prowling the conservatory repeatedly. "It was as though it sensed something amiss," she said. "A most curious observation," Whimsy mused. "Animals often perceive what we overlook. The cat's agitation may indicate the presence of a visitor or an event unaccounted for." Whimsy then requested to inspect the conservatory, which they did with measured care. The room was a sanctuary of tropical plants, their glossy leaves still moist with evening dew. The air held the faintest trace of a scent unfamiliar, a subtle hint of something floral, yet distinctly foreign. "Do you recognize this fragrance, Mrs. Potts?" Whimsy asked. The housekeeper sniffed thoughtfully. "No, my lord. We grow nothing of the sort here." A glance toward the windows revealed a slight smudge on the glass pane nearest the door, an imprint of a hand, smeared but still visible in the soft morning light. Whimsy knelt, inspecting the mark with a practiced eye. "This was not made by our own hands." "Could it be a clue, my lord?" Craik asked. It is more than that. It is a signature, albeit an unintentional one. As the morning deepened, the detective's inquiries turned to the canon's personal correspondences. Among the letters was one in a shaky, almost desperate hand, addressed simply, "To my dearest friend, if you still listen." It was unsigned, but the tone betrayed a relationship strained by secrets and regret. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. The canon was not as solitary as he appeared. When pressed, Mrs. Agatha admitted to having removed several letters from her husband's study after his passing, fearing scandal. "I thought it best to protect his reputation," she said with a quiet dignity. Whimsy allowed himself a thin smile. "Reputations, madam, are often the shields behind which truth hides." The day drew on, and the rectory's inhabitants grew restless under the quiet scrutiny that seemed to pervade every corner. Yet Whimsy remained outwardly composed, his mind a web of possibilities. Later, as the light waned and shadows stretched long across the tiled floors, Whimsy requested the presence of all household members once more. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, took in each face, the rigid formality, the concealed unease, the flickers of guilt or relief. "I thank you all for your patience," he began. "The path ahead is clearer now, though still winding. We have uncovered motives of envy, secrets of old debts, and evidence of a hidden visitor. The time discrepancies suggest that not all clocks, and not all witnesses, are to be trusted." He paused, allowing his words to settle like dust. "But the question remains, who sought to silence the canon, and why?" No one answered. The room seemed to hold its breath. Whimsy looked towards the window where the cat, ever vigilant, crouched beneath the fading light. "In the morrow," he said softly, "we shall revisit the scene of the crime with fresh eyes and a mind unclouded by haste." As he retired for the night, the detective's thoughts danced around the puzzle pieces. The restless cat, the mysterious visitor, the strange fragrance, and the fractured timeline. Somewhere within these lies the answer, quiet, unyielding, waiting to be unearthed. The morning light filtered gently through the leaded glass of the rectory's library, where Lord Peter Whimsy had requested to begin the day's inquiries. The room smelled faintly of old paper and wax polish, a repository of knowledge and memories. And here, amidst the volume of Canon Agatha's writings, the detective sought clarity. Whimsy seated himself at the large oak desk, flipping carefully through a worn leather-bound journal, its pages cramped with the canon's elegant script. He was looking not merely for facts, but for the tone, the psychological tremors beneath the ink. A man's mind laid bare, piece by intricate piece. As he read, the first light of understanding dawned. The canon was a man haunted by a secret, his past casting long shadows over his present. There were allusions to old debts unpaid, and to a visitor from the continent, a phrase at once vague and ominous. The journal suggested a connection to a woman named Elodie, whose name stirred something in the margins, scrawled with particular emphasis and unease. The door creaked softly, and Inspector Craik entered, carrying a folder of documents collected overnight. "I thought this might interest you," he said, laying out a series of letters and telegrams from the local post office records. "Correspondence between the canon and someone abroad. The dates align with your visitor from the continent." Whimsy's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "Excellent, Craik. Now we have a temporal and emotional thread to follow." The letters spoke of clandestine meetings and veiled threats, penned in a hand that was elegant yet strained. The tone was one of desperation mixed with regret, a relationship fraught with unresolved tensions. Whimsy tapped a particular passage, "Must end before the truth unravels all. I fear the shadows close fast." Certainly the canon's fears were justified. Whimsy mused aloud. But who exactly was this Elodie, and what could she want here? The question hung in the air like a wraith. Turning to Craik, Whimsy outlined a plan. We must trace this Elodie. There may be a physical manifestation of those shadows still lingering in our village. Craik nodded, though the weight of the task was apparent. The postmistress mentioned a foreign visitor who stayed at the inn briefly last month. I'll make inquiries. Whimsy then resumed his survey of the household's routine, this time focusing on the clockwork precision, or lack thereof, that seemed to govern life at the rectory. His previous observations about the clocks had not gone unnoticed. "Mrs. Potts," he said when she was summoned again, "there is a matter of the conservatory door's lock that troubles me. You mentioned it was sometimes neglected. Might it be that someone exploited this laxity?" The housekeeper's eyes flickered, a subtle tightening at the corners. "I suppose it's possible, my lord. The lock is old and sometimes sticks, but we have no reason to expect anyone would take advantage. Yet the door was found ajar on the night of the murder," Whimsy persisted. "A breach, literal and figurative." Mrs. Potts nodded, albeit reluctantly. "Yes, my lord." The detective's gaze lingered thoughtfully. "And the scent in the conservatory, the unfamiliar perfume. Miss Agatha brought some exotic flowers inside recently," Mrs. Potts recalled, "but no others have been near the room." Whimsy mused aloud. Perhaps a visitor brought something with them, a token or a clue inadvertently left behind. The atmosphere thickened with unspoken suspicion as the afternoon shadows lengthened. Yet Whimsy's mind was far from idle. Every detail, every contradiction was being woven into an invisible tapestry. Later, in the drawing room, he conducted a subtle interrogation of Reginald once more. The nephew's earlier nervousness had curdled into a guarded defensiveness. "Reginald," Whimsy began, "you seem troubled by more than just the canon's will. There is a strain in your voice when certain names are mentioned." Reginald's composure faltered. "I'm not proud of my feelings, Lord Peter. Uncle was difficult. There were disagreements, financial and otherwise." "Indeed. And this Elodie, had you heard of her before?" The young man's eyes darted away. "Only whispers." "Whispers," Whimsy echoed, arching a brow. "Often the most telling evidence lies in what is not spoken openly." Reginald's lips tightened. "I would have preferred to shield the family from scandal. But as Mrs. Agatha wisely remarked, reputations are the masks behind which truth hides." Reginald's shoulders slumped in silent defeat. Whimsy's thoughts then turned to the strange behavior of the cat, a curious observer who seemed to have sensed the disturbance. It was Miss Agatha who confirmed the animal's nocturnal restlessness, particularly near the conservatory. "Animals often detect what we miss," Whimsy said softly. "If the cat was disturbed, there may have been movement or presence we have yet to account for." He requested a thorough search of the conservatory, now under the watchful eyes of the household. In the damp earth beneath a fern, Craik uncovered a small scrap of paper, folded and hidden from casual view. Whimsy carefully unfolded it, revealing a brief but urgent note. "Meet me at dusk. Secrets shall surface. Trust none." The note was unsigned but bore a faint scent of the same exotic perfume previously noted. "This is no idle scribble," Whimsy declared. "It is a summons, perhaps from Elodie herself, or someone equally desperate." The household's tension became palpable, and yet Whimsy's face was as impassive as ever. He next sought out Miss Hilda, the nurse, whose earlier vagueness about the unlocked conservatory door now seemed more significant. "Miss Hilda," Whimsy began with his usual polite firmness, "is there anything you neglected to mention about that night? Any visitors? Any strange sounds or sudden movements?" The nurse's eyes flickered with hesitation before she spoke. "There was someone, a man. I didn't recognize him. He asked for the canon, but I told him he was resting. He did not say his name." "A visitor in the dark hours," Whimsy said thoughtfully. "And this man, did you notice anything peculiar? His accent, manner, or anything unusual about his appearance? Miss Hilda shook her head. Only that he smelled faintly of jasmine. Jasmine, Whimsy repeated, a fragrance matching the note, a thread we must follow. The day waned, and Whimsy sat back, the web of clues and characters tightening inexorably. The foreign visitor, the clandestine notes, the unlocked door, the restless cat, and the cryptic journal entries now formed a coherent outline. Yet the crux of the matter remained concealed beneath layers of social propriety and human frailty. Whimsy mused, "The motive must be more than money. It is tangled in past grievances, in secrets held close and perhaps regretted." His gaze fell again on the cat, which had taken its habitual position on the windowsill, watching the garden with inscrutable eyes. "Tomorrow we shall revisit the exact timeline, recalibrate the clocks, and perhaps, at last, draw forth the truth that has long slumbered in this quiet rectory." The household, subdued but attentive, could do little but await the unfolding of Lord Peter Whimsy's inexorable logic, patiently and with a distinct flavor of British irony in the air, as the rectory's shadows lengthened toward their inevitable reveal. The morning unfolded with an almost deceptive calm, the rectory's ancient walls basking in a pale June sunlight that seemed to mock the darkness still lurking within. Lord Peter Whimsy, having spent a restless night poring over the canon's journal and the new evidence, convened a gathering of the household in the drawing-room. It was to be, as he gently intimated, an exercise in theatrical reconstruction, an effort to piece together the invisible moments that had led to the tragic demise of Canon Agatha. The assembled faces were a gallery of apprehension and thinly concealed curiosity. Reginald's jaw was set with a stubbornness that threatened to snap under pressure. Mrs. Potts clutched her handkerchief, eyes darting between the windows as if seeking escape. Miss Hilda, the nurse, sat rigidly, her expression betraying a conflict between fear and loyalty. Inspector Craik stood near the door, his clipboard ready but his manner deferential, a reflection of the deference often paid to Whimsy's singular intellect. Whimsy began with a precise recapitulation of the evening of the murder, pacing slowly, hands clasped behind his back. We know indisputably that the canon retired to his study at precisely 9:15 p.m., according to both the hall clock and the servant's testimony. He was seen there alone until the clock struck 10. Yet at some point between 10 and 10:30, the fatal blow was dealt. He paused, eyes flicking over the group, allowing the weight of his words to settle. The question, naturally, is who had opportunity and motive to commit such an act. Opportunity was scarce, Reginald interjected. The house was nearly deserted, save for the servants, who assure us they were elsewhere. Indeed, Whimsy replied dryly, and yet the door to the conservatory, the supposed site of the murder weapon's final rest, was found ajar. Mrs. Potts, you confirmed the lock was somewhat temperamental. Mrs. Potts nodded, cheeks flushing. Yes, my lord. It sometimes does not secure properly, especially if the bolt is not fully slid. Precisely, Whimsy said. And that is no trivial detail. It opens the possibility that someone entered or exited through that door unobserved. But let us consider the timing. The canon's voice was heard clearly at 10, speaking with Miss Hilda in the adjoining room. Miss Hilda nodded. Yes, I was attending to him briefly. He seemed troubled, but insisted on no disturbance thereafter. Yet between 10 and 10:30 a visitor arrived, Whimsy continued, turning to Craik. The nurse mentioned a man, scented faintly of jasmine, who came seeking the canon. Inspector Craik cleared his throat. We have traced no such visitor in the immediate records. The inn reported no guest matching that description during that time. Which suggests, Whimsy mused, that the visitor was not a registered guest, but someone with clandestine intent. He turned sharply to Reginald. Nephew, you have been unusually silent on the subject of this visitor's identity. Care to enlighten us? Reginald's composure cracked, and he exhaled sharply. I only know what I overheard in hushed tones. Elodie's arrival stirred unrest. There were threats exchanged. I feared for Uncle's safety, but dared not intervene. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. So Elodie, the woman from the continent, arrived unannounced, and a confrontation ensued. And it did, Reginald admitted, voice low. I heard raised voices, then silence. I dared not investigate further. Quite prudent, Whimsy replied. And what of the note found beneath the fern? Meet me at dusk. Secrets shall surface. This could hardly be coincidence. Mrs. Potts interrupted timidly. I thought it strange when I found it, my lord, but no one else seemed concerned. An understandable oversight, Whimsy said, but not one we can afford. The detective then invited the household to recreate the timeline physically. With measured steps, Whimsy and the assembled party walked the rectory's corridors, examining each room, each door, each clock that might betray a fragment of truth. It was in the conservatory that his attention was most acute. The glass panels here are thin, susceptible to sound, Whimsy observed, tapping lightly. Yet the canon's voice was unheard beyond the study. How is this to be explained? Miss Hilda answered hesitantly. The thick curtains were drawn. They muffle sound quite effectively. Exactly, Whimsy replied. Soundproofing by accident, not design. A clue in itself. He turned to Craig. Have we established the exact position of the cannon when struck? Craig consulted his notes. The wound indicates a blow from behind, delivered swiftly, probably at close quarters. Whimsy's fingers tapped rhythmically on the window frame. Then the assailant must have been in the conservatory, or immediately outside. The ajar door would have been the means of access. And the scent of jasmine, Mrs. Potts asked. An identifying mark, Whimsy said. A subtle signature left by the killer or a miscalculation in concealment. As the afternoon deepened, Whimsy's scrutiny turned to the odd behavior of the clocks themselves. The hall clock, the study clock, the grandfather clock in the drawing room, they were each out of sync by several minutes. A trivial matter, perhaps, but in a house governed by routine, it was significant. Who winds the clocks? Whimsy inquired. The butler, Mr. Fenwick, Mrs. Potts answered. Mr. Fenwick, would you care to explain the discrepancies? The butler, a grim man with steel-grey eyes, spoke quietly. The clocks have been temperamental lately. I wind them every morning, but they gain or lose time unpredictably. A convenient complaint, Whimsy remarked dryly. Might it not be that the clocks were deliberately misset to fabricate a false timeline? Fenwick's face remained unreadable, but his fingers twitched slightly. Whimsy pressed on. Were you in the conservatory that evening, Mr. Fenwick? Only briefly, Fenwick replied. To place the canon's papers on his desk as instructed. And did you notice anything unusual? Fenwick hesitated. A strange perfume, jasmine, I believe. Exactly, Whimsy said. And where might such a scent come from at this hour? Fenwick's eyes flickered to the floor. I cannot say. Whimsy's gaze hardened. Yet you admitted to being alone in the vicinity of the murder site, at the time when opportunity existed. The room fell silent. Suddenly, Reginald blurted out, Fenwick has always been distant, secretive. There were rumors that he despised the canon's growing fondness for Elodie. Mrs. Potts gasped softly, clutching her handkerchief anew. Whimsy smiled thinly, his sharp mind piecing together the strands. A motive hidden in plain sight, jealousy, fear, and the disruption of order. Fenwick's resentment may have festered beneath the veneer of servitude. Yet he did not accuse outright. Instead, Whimsy outlined his next step. A silent observation, a midnight vigil in the conservatory. There, behind the drawn curtains and beneath the watchful eyes of the restless cat, he intended to test his hypothesis. As evening fell, the household settled with strained nerves. Craig posted a discreet guard, while Whimsy positioned himself behind a screen, ready to watch, to listen, to catch the subtle movements that the mind alone might miss. Hours passed with the stillness of a tomb. Then, just before midnight, the faint creak of a door echoed in the conservatory. A shadow slipped inside, a figure moving with practiced stealth. Whimsy recognized the silhouette immediately. It was Mr. Fenwick. The butler moved toward the desk, his hand reaching for something concealed beneath the papers. The faint scent of jasmine filled the air once more, mingling with the night's chill. Whimsy stepped forward quietly, his voice calm but unmistakably commanding. "Mr. Fenwick, I believe your duplicity has been most instructive, if not altogether welcome." Caught, Fenwick's composure broke. He met Whimsy's gaze, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "You have no proof." "Proof," Whimsy smiled, "is a matter of perspective. But your perfume, your opportunity, your motive, all are threads in the same unraveling tapestry." The butler's shoulders sagged, and the house seemed to exhale as a long-hidden truth began to emerge into the light. The butler's confession, once coaxed gently but firmly from his tightening lips, was not the straightforward admission one might have anticipated in such melodramatic circumstances. Instead, it was a labyrinthine narrative, rich in shadowed motives and personal grievances, delivered in that peculiar, clipped cadence characteristic of men trained to conceal rather than reveal. As he spoke, Lord Peter Whimsy listened with the patient detachment of a scholar decoding a complex text, knowing that every half-truth and hesitant admission was but a tile in the mosaic of this tragedy. Fenwick began with the arrival of Elodie, the continental stranger whose presence had unsettled the rectory as a sudden storm might rattle the fragile panes of an ancient window. He described the tensions that had mounted, the whispered conversations behind closed doors, the subtle, corrosive shifts in the canon's demeanor. Once a man of resolute calm, now prone to moments of distraction and unease. Fenwick's tone suggested a man caught between loyalty to his employer and an unspoken personal animosity, an ambivalence that would prove crucial. "I confess, my lord," Fenwick said, his voice low, "that I bore a certain resentment towards Canon Agatha in his final weeks. His attentions to Miss Elodie were ill-advised, in my opinion, and disturbed the delicate equilibrium of this household. But resentment alone is a poor motive for murder." "Indeed it is," Whimsy agreed, "and yet circumstances often transform petty grievances into fatal decisions." Fenwick's eyes darkened. "I did confront him. It was on the evening of the murder. I sought to reason with him, to dissuade him from further involvement with Miss Elodie. The canon was unyielding, perhaps more agitated than I had expected. Words were exchanged. I admit, harsh words, but I left before any violence occurred." Whimsy inclined his head thoughtfully. "And where were you between 10 and 10:30 that evening?" "Alone, in the servants' quarters, ostensibly," Fenwick answered. "Though I confess, I ventured to the conservatory briefly, to ensure that the canon's papers were in order for the morning." "And the jasmine," Whimsy pressed. "It lingers as an unmistakable signature." Fenwick smiled thinly, a flicker of reluctant admiration crossing his features. "An unfortunate habit of mine, an imported cologne. I had no thought it would betray me so readily." Whimsy's gaze sharpened. "Yet we know the canon was struck from behind, swiftly, at close quarters. You deny presence at the exact moment of the blow?" "Absolutely," Fenwick said, voice firm. "I was not there. I left the conservatory minutes before the attack. I swear it." There was a pause, a weighty silence pregnant with unspoken possibilities. Whimsy knew the value of a well-placed pause. It was the detective's most subtle tool. "Then the question remains," Whimsy mused aloud. "Who else had both motive and opportunity?" Eyes turned uneasily to Reginald, whose earlier reticence seemed now to deepen. Whimsy's arched brow lifted. "You may be a man of taciturn nature, Mr. Merrick," he observed, "but even the most reserved have their limits when burdened with guilt or fear." Reginald's composure fractured. He swallowed audibly before speaking. It is true that Elodie's arrival disturbed the household. She was no ordinary visitor. She came seeking a letter, one that could have destroyed my uncle's reputation and ours. I feared what that letter might contain and what its revelation might mean. "A letter?" Whimsy prompted. "Yes," Reginald admitted, eyes fixed on the floor. "A document from my uncle's past, something he had long sought to keep buried." "And this letter?" Whimsy pressed gently. "Where is it now?" "Missing," Reginald said bitterly, "and I fear that in the confusion of that night someone took it." Whimsy's mind raced. The missing letter was a pivotal piece, potentially the key to motive and misdirection. He recalled the absence of the salver on which the canon's correspondence had usually been placed, a detail that had seemed trivial at the time but now assumed new significance. "Mrs. Potts," Whimsy addressed the housekeeper, "you mentioned a misplaced salver." "Yes, my lord," she answered, wringing her hands. "It was nowhere to be found in the morning, though I searched thoroughly." "Where was it usually kept?" "In the study, near the canon's desk. I thought perhaps it had been taken for cleaning, but no one can recall seeing it." "A disappearance concurrent with a murder is rarely coincidental," Whimsy noted. The detective's eyes then turned toward Miss Hilda. "You tended to the canon that evening. Did he mention anything unusual?" The nurse's gaze dropped shyly. "He seemed anxious, more than just the usual weariness. He whispered about secrets and about regret. He feared that his past would catch up with him." Whimsy tapped his chin thoughtfully. "Secrets, regret, a letter, the scent of jasmine, a door left ajar, all pieces of a complex jigsaw." He moved to the window, peering out into the darkening garden. "We have been entangled in the web of appearances and half-truths. Yet there is one element we have not fully explored, the figure of Elodie herself. A catalyst, a harbinger, perhaps more." "Are you suggesting she may have had a hand in this?" Craik asked sharply. Whimsy smiled, a thin, enigmatic curve. "Not necessarily. But her presence forced hidden matters into the open. It is possible that someone acted in desperation to silence the canon before he could reveal too much." A sudden knock interrupted the moment, and the butler entered with a letter sealed in black wax. The postmarked envelope bore no return address. Whimsy took it carefully and broke the seal. The letter was brief, penned in an elegant yet hurried script. "The truth lies where shadows gather. Look to the clock that never tells the right time. Justice demands patience." Whimsy's eyes flickered with renewed purpose. The reference was cryptic but unmistakably pointed toward the errant clocks, the subtle, almost imperceptible anomaly they had earlier noted. "The clocks," Whimsy mused aloud, "have been manipulated. Not by chance, but by design. To mislead, to confuse. The killer sought to fabricate an alibi through temporal disarray. Then who had the knowledge and access to perform such a deception?" Mrs. Potts whispered. Whimsy's expression darkened. "One who understands the household's rhythms intimately. One who winds the clocks and controls the passages of time in this house." Mr. Fenwick, the butler, stiffened but did not speak. "Yet Fenwick insists he was not present at the moment of the murder. Could he have an accomplice?" "Or," Whimsy suggested, "he could have been misdirecting us, confident that no one would notice the minor details. Clocks out of sync, the door ajar, a missing salver. It is often the smallest crack in the facade that lets the light through." The detective's eyes met those of every person in the room. "I propose we reconstruct the night once more, under controlled observation. We shall test every timeline, every alibi, and every shadow." The group agreed, a mixture of apprehension and reluctant hope stirring in the air. As the evening deepened, Whimsy retired to the study to prepare for the reenactment. He examined the clocks once more, each stubbornly refusing to tell the same time, a deliberate cacophony of discord. He traced the mechanism of the hall clock with a delicate touch, noting an unusual looseness in the minute hand's pin. "A subtle tampering," he murmured, "enough to create confusion, but not to alert the casual observer." It was in this minutiae, the whispered misalignments, the faint perfumes, the silences filled with unseen menace, that the truth awaited discovery. Whimsy smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a chess player several moves ahead. Tomorrow's revelations would bring clarity. For now, the cat slept once more upon the murder weapon, an inscrutable sentinel in a house of secrets. But the game was far from over. The drawing room was hushed beneath the heavy curtains drawn tight against the creeping dawn. Lord Peter Whimsy stood amid the assembled household, the faint scent of jasmine lingering like a whispered accusation. He held the missing salver in his hand, a simple silver tray, now tarnished by the weight of truths it had borne. "My friends," he began, his voice cool and deliberate, "we have come to the moment where all the threads of this tangled web must be drawn taut. The night of Canon Agatha's demise was not a tragedy born of impulse, but of careful design and desperate calculation." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "We know that the murderer sought to manipulate time itself, to mislead the watchers and confuse the timelines. The clocks in this house were tampered with, not by mere mischief, but to construct a false alibi. The hall clock, with its loosened minute hand, was the linchpin. Who else but the person who winds and tends to these clocks could perform such subtle deceit?" Fenwick's jaw clenched, but his gaze did not waver. The salver's disappearance was no accident. Concealed beneath its absence was the missing letter, the very document which held the power to ruin reputations and unravel secrets. And the letter was hidden where none would think to look, inside the conservatory's oldest pot, beneath the roots of the jasmine bush. A gasp came from Mrs. Potts. "The jasmine itself is the final clue," Whimsy said, lifting a slender sprig from the mantelpiece. "The scent, Fenwick, is your signature, a fragrance you habitually wore. You hoped it would betray you only to those who might puzzle it out." Fenwick's facade cracked. "It is true," he said quietly. "I feared the letter's revelation would destroy everything my master had worked for, and us with him. But I did not intend murder. It was meant as a warning." "Yet the warning became a weapon," Whimsy observed, "and your temper overcame restraint." "The canon confronted me," Fenwick admitted, voice low. "The argument escalated. I struck him with the paperweight. I did not think he would fall so quickly." Whimsy nodded. A crime of passion disguised beneath the veneer of loyalty and service. He turned to Reginald Merrick. "And you, who feared the past catching up, whose silence was forged in anxiety and dread, your own motives were tangled in inheritance and the shadow of disgrace. But it was Fenwick who acted, propelled by loyalty, twisted into desperation." Reginald exhaled, relief and sorrow mingling in his eyes. "Miss Elodie's role," Whimsy continued, "was that of the catalyst, her arrival unsettling the house like a sudden storm. Yet despite suspicions, she remained a stranger to the darker deeds within these walls." He looked around at the faces gathered, their masks of civility forever altered. "The clocks may lie, the doors may be left ajar, and the letter may vanish, but human nature, the complexities of guilt, fear, and love, cannot be so easily disguised." Whimsy paused, then added with a dry smile, "And as for the cat who slept upon the murder weapon, it seems even felines possess a keen instinct for the unspeakable." The room remained silent as Fenwick was led away, the burden of his crime pressing down with a finality no clock could measure. As the first light of morning crept across the lawn, Whimsy lit a cigarette and mused aloud. "Justice is often not the triumph of the obvious, but the quiet revelation of what lies beneath the polished surface. A lesson, perhaps, that even the most genteel houses harbor. shadows best not disturbed, or at least only by those equipped to read them. With a nod to the assembled company, Lord Peter Whimsy turned and strode toward the door, his silhouette framed against the awakening day. The cat stretched languidly on the window ledge, utterly unconcerned by human affairs. "Good day to you all," Whimsy said, "and may your clocks always tell the truth, at least until the next time they do not." And with that, the great detective vanished into the morning mist, leaving behind a household forever changed by the shadow that had passed through its midst.